thing I remember most visually is the ascent stage of the lunar module, the ascent stage of Eagle, in front of my window, and then in the background seeing the lunar horizon and seeing the Earth pop up above it, so that you had the horizon, the lunar module, and the Earth all in a row. I thought that was something that would rarely be seen again, and I remember that most vividly.
I think for me the most memorable time may not have been one that the happening I was most aware of, but I've had occasion to challenge my memory and think back of those first few seconds when Neil and I touched down, and there were numerous things that we needed to do, but we also needed to announce to the world that we were there, and then pause for a moment, and things were quiet, and we gazed out the window, and it was just a magnificent view, and that's the most impressive memory that I carry now, because I refer back to it so many times.
Apollo 11 was filled with vivid experiences. One that comes to mind in my case is the flying through the moon's shadow and seeing the sun eclipsed by the moon as we approached it. That was a very spectacular sight.
There's so many things that can go wrong on a trip to the moon and back. It's sort of a long and fragile daisy chain of events, and I can remember being in the mobile quarantine facility, the little house trailer aboard the aircraft carrier after we landed in the Pacific, and thinking, gee, none of them did. None of those little links broke, and to me that was the amazing part, that everything worked in some as well as it did.
I think perhaps the final descent to the lunar surface was, for me, the highlight of the flight. It was very challenging. There were a lot of unknowns, and it was, for a pilot, it was a wonderful experience.
I think the most rewarding part of Apollo 11 was having it to be the major event in my life, which changed my life entirely and gave me an opportunity to reorder priorities and chart a course off for the future based on a new life of being a representative of the human race, having done a very significant thing. And it's enabled me to deal with that in a way where I feel very confident about the future and my participation in helping to shape the future of the space program.
Well, every launch day is a time of excitement, enthusiasm, and apprehension. But I think in most circumstances, you always feel that the chances of actually lifting off are fairly distant or remote, and you have to temper your enthusiasm with the realization that, in fact, you may be coming back in and trying to go another day.
I think the momentous, most memorable thing that I can recall about that particular day was the opportunity, while my two friends here were being put into the spacecraft, to stand alone by myself out there and look at the rocket and the quietness and see the sun come up and the waves rolling in and the evidence of the millions of people watching, but nothing specific, and just so quiet, and to realize that indeed such a contrast was going to take place, all the frantic activity preparing the rocket, but it was so quiet up there for me personally, and that in a very few moments we were going to be departing in a great roar and off for a momentous event.
Well, I think the impressions of the moon started much earlier on our approach, thousands of miles. As we got closer and closer, we could see more and more. As we got down into low orbit about the moon, we could see additionally more. We kept getting impressions. Then the final descent, you got closer, and after landing, of course, we were very close. We had hours to stand there a mere 15 feet, say, above the surface and look at pretty much everything that was available out the front windows. We had a sense of the gravity, the character of the environment there. So long before we actually got out on the surface, we already had pretty good appreciation for what the moon was like.
I agree with Neil. There are many different moons to remember. The one that we see from the Earth, the one that's en route, as we're sort of alone between the sun and the Earth and the moon. Then as we approach the moon, it's a different one. When you're in orbit, you look down on it, and it's a rather rough, lonesome, foreboding location. Neil had a much better view during the powered descent of that transition right down to the surface. I think I was relieved by the ease that we had in being able to maneuver around. Perhaps impressed by the talcum powder nature of the fine surface itself. As you'd look at a boot print, it just was so smooth, just like you'd put your foot in talcum powder. It was just a many-faceted moon. It was a stranger to me before the mission, but I now look back at it as somewhat of a friend, a place that I've visited.
Well, the thing about the moon that I thought was peculiar was that it seemed to depend on the angle of the sun. When the sun was almost overhead and it was noon down below, the moon appeared to be a warm and a friendly place. On the other hand, near dawn or dusk, it became very foreboding looking. The craters cast very long shadows, and the place looked distinctly unfriendly. So I was intrigued by the contrast based purely on what angle the sun happened to be coming from.
Well, of course, all three of us had flown in orbit before and seen the wonders of Earth as seen from space. This was a new experience for us in seeing it from a fairly long distance away. It does probably have a change in character as you become farther away. I think you most notice that, though, at the time you leave Earth. When you're departing at a great rate, it's very clear that this is an unusual experience.
Well, the Earth, as it appears from the moon, is a very small and fragile object. And when you think about it, that's not an inaccurate description. Certainly a lot of the things that we do down here can affect the balance in a very fragile way. The greenhouse effect we're noticing today, for example, the changes between a healthy atmosphere and an unhealthy atmosphere are very subtle, very, very fragile, and you sort of get that feeling when you look at the Earth from a great distance.
When we're on the surface of the moon, even though the Earth was only a slight 24 degrees off the vertical, there was no attraction on my part to divert my attention from where we were and what we were doing, to look up at it, except for the one time when we tried to take a moving picture, or a stirring picture, a memorable picture, and it certainly, in retrospect, looked awfully small. Personally, there was a time when an ironic thought sort of filtered through my mind that here Neil and I were so far away from home, much further than people had ever been, and yet at that same time there were more thoughts, concerns back so far away on what it is that we were doing at that very moment. And I thought that was very unique in the history of mankind.
Well, I enjoyed being in the command module by myself. It was a happy little home. All the machinery was working properly, and my concerns were not within the command module, but simply that something might go wrong with the LEM, with the lunar module, and these two guys might get stuck on the surface of the moon. That was my main concern.
Of course, we did go back a number of times after our departure, and for a combination of reasons, that program was terminated in favor of other new initiatives. Do you think there's an increasing momentum to go back to the moon? There studies of the moon are indicating more and more new reasons why it does make sense to go back, but I'm not in a position to say right now when we might make that next trip.
I'd prefer to see us go to Mars rather than go back to the moon, unless we need the moon as a stepping stone to Mars. It could be that in studying Mars, you will discover that the best way to do it is by way of a base on the moon, and if that turns out to be the case, well and good, but I see the moon really not as an end in itself, but really a stepping stone to deeper space, to Mars and to the planets beyond.
I look back on those days now of landing on the moon, and I try and put myself in the position of the historians, maybe even off into the future, that look back and see that it was an international challenge and response that prompted the president to chart a course for this nation to go there. But getting to some specifics, I'm aghast that just almost exactly 6 years to the day after we left the Earth to go to the moon and land, we launched a mission that, in essence, gave the Soviets the ability to say that they're equal to us, technically, and then we proceeded in the next 6 years not to even fly one human in space. And I think it's going to be inconceivable when future historians look back and see that what a tremendous capability was put together by one nation, and then it was sort of set aside and laid to rest. I hope that we don't do that in the future. I feel that as humans expand outward, that they should be in a gradual, continuous, self-sustaining way, and I suspect that it will involve visiting the moon simultaneously or in melding together with our growing visits of humans to Mars. I would expect to see them happening at about the same time, and we'd use the moon where necessary to prove out things. I agree with Mike that the nation needs a strong goal, strong objective, and Mars is a much clearer one to use as our compelling drawing force into the future.
People who come here to this museum and look at our spacecraft Columbia are most often struck by its small size, which from their perspective is understandable. From our point of view, the command module was a wonderful improvement over our previous spacecraft, which were really cramped. And so we enjoyed the luxury of a big volume machine.
Yeah, I thought we had amazingly good accommodations. We had hot and cold water. The food was even edible. All in all, it was a nicely packaged small enclosure, and we could comfortably have stayed there far in excess of 8 days. To me, the important thing is that we learned that human beings can operate successfully on the surface of another planet. We don't have to stay here on Earth. We have a choice of where we want to go and stay, either here on Earth or on the moon or beyond the moon on a place like Mars. I think that was to me, the fundamental lesson of Apollo. We can operate successfully in places other than the surface of the Earth.